For most anti-fascists in Europe, certainly in Britain, where I was active in the Anti-Nazi League and so on, the Holocaust is a warning of the dangers of fascism and racism. We draw universal conclusions that it must never happen again, never again. But for the Zionists, never again doesn't mean never again for everyone, but simply never again for Jews. And therefore, anything is justified in order to perpetuate the Israeli state. And so Gideon Levy, for instance, in an article in Haaretz, remarked on how each year thousands of Israeli school children are taken to Auschwitz. And the lesson they draw is not that Gaza must not happen because of Auschwitz, but on the contrary, what happens in Gaza is justified because of Auschwitz. That is the lesson that the Zionists draw. It's the exact opposite of the conclusions that anyone who's anti-racist or anti-fascist would draw. And that is why the Holocaust is never seen as a product of fascism, but simply an irrational, eternal hatred of Jews as Jews.
Hello everyone, I'm Rania Khalek, and this is the full episode of Dispatches, available exclusively to patrons of Breakthrough News. Israel was not founded because of the Holocaust, nor is its behavior driven by so-called Holocaust trauma. Rather, the Holocaust has been weaponized to demonize and dehumanize Israel's victims, to immunize the Zionist state from criticism, and to justify its ongoing colonialism and genocide in Gaza. It's through this weaponization of the Holocaust that Israel can portray itself not as the aggressor, but as the eternal victim with a permanent get-out-of-jail-free card. In fact, what truly drives Israel, similar to colonial movements before it, isn't victimhood, but land theft mixed with a fear that its indigenous victims will seek retribution. Joining me to discuss this and more is Tony Greenstein, a long-standing Jewish anti-Zionist, Marxist, and anti-fascist activist from the UK, and author of Zionism During the Holocaust. Tony, welcome to the show.
Yeah, welcome to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. And I'm really excited to talk about the subject matter at hand, which is this excellent piece that she wrote for the Electronic Intifada, which I encourage everyone to go check out. The title is Israel's Holocaust Trauma is a Myth. And you very meticulously go through why that's the case. Before I ask you any questions about that, I want to play this clip that you actually opened the piece with. And this is going to be a clip of Naftali Bennett speaking to Sky News a few months ago, and more, closer to the beginning of the genocide in Gaza, where he does reference the Holocaust in a very typical way to kind of justify or actually antagonize the host for daring to ask about Gaza's civilian population. So let's take a listen to that, and then we can go from there.
And what about those Palestinians in hospital who are on life support, and babies and incubators whose life support and incubator will have to be turned off because the Israelis have cut the power to Gaza?
Are you seriously keep on asking me about Palestinian civilians? What's wrong with you? Have you not seen what happened? We're fighting Nazis. We don't target them. Now, the world can come and bring them anything they want. If you want to bring them electricity, I'm not going to feed electricity or water to my enemies. If anyone else wants, that's fine. We're not responsible for them.
This is the point.
But you
this
keep
is the
on.
point.
I want to tell you. Listen. You listen to me right now. I've heard you enough.
No, I understand. We're trying to have a conversation here. Listen, this is my program. This is my show. And I am asking the questions. You're raising your voice, and I've asked you, and we've already...
That's about enough of that. I can't listen to Naftali Bennett whine much longer. But I mean, that's pretty emblematic of the sort of attitude that you get from Israeli government officials, and often, always have, but really in a more extreme way. And so, you wrote in this piece that I referenced for the Electronic Intifada, the lazy explanation for Israel's genocidal and exterminationist mentality is Holocaust trauma. Using the Holocaust,
correct. Yeah,
using the Holocaust as a catch-all explanation is convenient because it absolves people of the need to look for the real cause of Israeli Zionist violence. So go ahead and explain to us, based on what I just set up, based on Naftali Bennett's comments, Why is this Holocaust trauma that Israel often references to justify its atrocity such a myth?
Well, the Zionist movement has used the Holocaust almost since its inception. I mean, there is nothing new in what Naftali Bennett said. I mean, he is a Judeo-Nazi, a Jewish Nazi. I mean, let's face it, there's no difference really between what Hans Frank, the Governor General, the Nazi Governor General of Poland, said when he talked about death by hunger, and 83,000 people, Jews, died in the Warsaw Ghetto from hunger, not from deportation to Treblinka. There's nothing new at all. When the Holocaust survivors were forced to go to Palestine and then Israel after 1945, and they were wanted primarily as cannon fodder for the so-called War of Independence. There is nothing new in this at all. When the Holocaust survivors were forced to go to Palestine after 1945, and you may not know, but in the displaced persons camps of Europe, Haganah was active in suppressing Jewish anti-Zionists, the Bund supporters, those who survived the Holocaust and so on. They were told when they got to Israel and when they were fighting, conscripted into the Israeli Defense Force or the Zionist terror militias, Haganah, Egan, Lehi, they were told by David Ben-Gurion in the fledgling army that they were fighting the new Nazis. That was in 1947, 1948. So there is really nothing new about this. And the worst, those who committed the worst atrocities, those who were the fiercest in their hatred of the indigenous Palestinians, were the Holocaust survivors, because in their eyes, the Palestinians were attacking them because they were Jewish. That was the theme. That's always been the theme. Of course, we know that's not true. But, you know, when you're brought from Europe and you've been living in a displaced persons camp, you know nothing of the history, you know nothing of the background, so you would have been very susceptible to that message. So fast forward 75 years, and why would the Palestinians break out of Gaza? It wouldn't have anything to do with the siege, still less to do with the occupation. After all, Israel treats them wonderfully. So it could only be because they hate Israelis because they're Jews, and they come to them as Jews, and they call them Yahud because that's how they know them. So the Holocaust as a narrative has always been present in Zionism, whether it's labor Zionism or revisionist Zionism, whether it's, if you like, Herzog from the labor Zionist tradition, or Naftali Bennett from the far right of the Zionist movement. The theme has always been the same. Of course, this is hypocritical because after the Holocaust in Israel, they really did not want to know very much about the Holocaust because they were building a new Jew, they were building a new country. And the Holocaust survivors reminded them of the old accursed galut, diaspora. And you know, if you listen to some of what they say about the diaspora Jews, if you didn't know who was talking, you would think it was a convinced neo-Nazi. I mean, if I can plug my book, which I've just written very recently, it's on Zionism during the Holocaust. And it gives many, many examples. There's of this. Joachim Doron, who's a political scientist historian in Israel, wrote an article for the Journal of Israeli History, which is, I think, the main journal of the Zionist movement. Classic Zionism and its enemies. And he said if you didn't know, say, who was talking, it would be the anti-Semites. And he said it must sound strange to people brought up in the Auschwitz generation to hear what the Zionists were saying about Jews, because it really was no different from what their enemies were saying. So there was nothing at all different from what Ben-Gurion was saying in 1948 to what Naftali Bennett was saying. in 2024. The message was the same. You hate us not because we've come and stolen your land and driven you off it, but because we're Jewish. It's as if the white South Africans have been saying to those living under apartheid, you're not fighting us because of the system of apartheid, land dispossession, and so on, but simply because we're white. And for many of them, that was the case. So, I mean, this is the reaction of the traditional settler colonial. But in Israel at the time, as I said, they really didn't want to know about the Holocaust. I mean, Holocaust survivors were called sabon, soap. They were treated with contempt. Hansi Brandt, who was the wife of Rudolf Kastner, a very famous collaborator, said that they simply didn't want to know. When I talked about our war, they talked about their war. That they treated them, I won't say with hostility, but with a visible irritation. They didn't want to know about what had occurred in the diaspora. Israel was a new startup nation. It was a breaking free of the accursed galut, the diaspora. Because as Ben Gurion said, there's been a gap of 2,000 years in the history of the Jewish people, and it's only now been resumed with the birth of the Israeli state. So that was always the case. So when October the 7th happened, it was a terrible shock. I have absolutely no doubt about it. But it was a shock that all settler colonials experience when those they've been oppressing for so long rise up against them. I mean, that was the case in the slave plantations in the Caribbean. It was true in America, in the United States. You had the Nat Turner Rebellion. You had other rebellions. They were put down with savagery. You had the Governor Eyre controversy in Jamaica in the 1870s when there was a vicious counter-reaction by the governor and the planters there. Again, it had nothing to do with their opponents being white. It had everything to do with the role they played. So in Haiti, for example, Santo Domingo, with a successful slave uprising in, I think it was 1791, the black population slaughtered every single white French person. I mean, they were quite savage. I mean, far, far worse than anything that occurred on October the 7th. Though incidentally, the German whites were spared. So it simply wasn't because they were white. It was because of where they came from and what they were doing. And I have no doubt on October the 7th, there were some atrocities. In every war, you get that. But it really, of course, is nothing compared to the savagery of Israel today. I mean, you can't compare it. So, I mean, there was no Holocaust trauma. I mean, in Israel, in the first syllabus, school syllabus, the history school syllabus, which was about 200 pages long, had, I think, 12 pages on the Napoleonic Wars. It had one on the Holocaust. So at that time, the Holocaust was something that was in the distant past. It was part of...
That's actually what I want to get you to elaborate on that for a moment, and in terms of the Holocaust in Israeli life, because what you're alluding to is what you talk about in your piece as well, as you raise this point that in fact the Holocaust didn't play a major role in Israeli life until 1953, when it was first mentioned in the school syllabus. And I'm going to quote from your piece. It says, despite exploiting the Holocaust survivors, Israelis had contempt for them as sheep who had gone to the slaughter. Unlike them, the quote, new Jews in Palestine who were waging war against the indigenous population. And then you note it's been documented that the survivors were popularly called this Hebrew word for soap, due to a belief that the Nazis had used their human fat to make soap during the war. And then there's this prevailing view among settlers in Palestine was that Holocaust survivors represented, quote, the survival of the worst in the eyes of David Ben-Gurion. They were hard, evil, and selfish people, and their experiences destroyed what good qualities they have left. So I guess to that, I want to ask you if you can maybe explain to our audience this very antagonistic view towards Holocaust survivors inside the state of Israel. And when the Holocaust even started to be weaponized in the ways that, we see it being weaponized now, because it clearly didn't happen. I mean, you mentioned it happened in refugee camps to get people to go fight in 1948 against the indigenous population in Palestine to formulate the state of Israel. But then after that, it's kind of ignored until it's brought back in. And then there's the pretty horrible treatment of actual Holocaust survivors inside the state of Israel, to the point where the Israeli government was even taking reparations meant for them and putting it in their own coffer. So I know I just mentioned a lot for you to unpack there, but yeah, if you could maybe talk about the role of the Holocaust in the state of Israel, kind of from its birth to now, and what that's meant for actual Holocaust survivors.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you like, most people believe that Israel was set up as a refuge for Jews from anti-Semitism. I mean, that's a common popular myth, and it's something that's believed by Jews worldwide. But it's simply not true. Israel, if you like, the Zionist project's main aim was the creation, it was like, if you like, a racial preservation project. And the only way you could achieve that was via statehood. I mean, that was what it was about in essence. And Ben Gurion was absolutely clear when he made his famous statement that if I knew I could save all of the German Jewish children, this was the Kindertransport in 1938-39, if I could save all the German Jewish children, because Britain had agreed to admit 10,000 by going to England, and only half of them by going to Palestine, I would choose the latter course, because I have to look to the people of history, not simply the lives of those children. And even in the early 1920s, when thousands of Ukrainian Jews wanted to escape to Palestine to get away from the pogroms, Weizmann was adamant that they couldn't come in. They were the wrong sort of Jews. They were precisely the detritus of the diaspora, and they didn't want them. And they always had this policy of selectivity, and it continued throughout the war. And there was real resentment, if you read what the Zionist leaders were saying, that refugees were coming in who had nothing to offer. So, I mean, this idea was a myth. And in my book, I detail the Argentinian junta between 1976 to 83. I don't know whether you're aware of what happened, but it's a story in itself. The first, probably the only neo-Nazi regime to come to power in the post-war period was in Argentina. And they had their own conspiracy theory, the Andina conspiracy. Instead of the normal elders of Zion, it was Marx, Freud, and Einstein who were the trio who were trying to create a Jewish state in Patagonia. And up to 12.5% of the 30,000 Argentinians who died under torture were Jewish, even though Argentinian Jews constitute less than 1% of the population. And did Israel want to know? The Knesset wouldn't even discuss the matter throughout the whole period of the junta, because it was arming them, it was giving them weapons, and Argentina was the biggest single purchaser of Israeli weapons. And Israel was a fundamental part of the anti-communist alliance, which Argentina was a part of under Reagan. So this idea that Israel was a refuge, when the Israeli embassy was turning away applications for visas from people whose lives were in danger. And to this day, I mean, there's a silence over Israel's role there. So I think we need to debunk this idea that Israel is a Jewish state in anything other than a racial form. It's a state of Jewish supremacy, but it's not a state that serves or has any meaning for Jews living in the diaspora, and that's kind of the myth that's grown up. But throughout history, Zionism and anti-Semitism were kind of twins of a kind. They couldn't survive without each other. and that was reflected in the attitudes to the Holocaust. I mean, today, you have rabbis like Rabbi Kashtiel saying, well, Hitler was right, he just got the wrong target. It should have been the Palestinians, although I don't think there were many Palestinians in Nazi Germany at any time. But that is their attitude. They have no basic objection to the Nazi program. That is the irony of Zionism, which claims to be the solution to anti-Semitism. So the Holocaust really did not figure. It was the myth of Masada, where the few hundred Jewish zealots allegedly committed suicide rather than surrender to the Romans in the Judean fortress of Masada. That was the main myth that the Israeli state fostered right up till really the Eichmann trial in 1961. And it was then, the opening speech of Gideon Hausner, the prosecutor, was when he spoke about Jews in Europe having gone like sheep to the slaughter. That was their attitude. And really, even that attitude continues today. Israel commemorates the Holocaust on, I think, 3 days a year, national holidays, speeches, and so on, parades. But that is different from the actual Holocaust survivors who still continue to live in Israel. They live in poverty, many of them, over a third. They choose between food and eating and heating. Their reparations, Ben-Gurion was insistent, should go to the Jewish state, not to them individually. It would be the Jewish state that carved them out. There were different arrangements in other countries when it was handled by the Jewish Claims Conference, but that's another story anyway, because the corruption in that organization, where just millions of dollars were simply embezzled by people like Rabbi Israel Singer, for example. Quite a number were sent to prison in these scandals, but the Holocaust survivors have been seen as an expendable commodity, very, very useful, of course, for propagating Israel's image as the answer to age-old anti-Semitism. And the Eichmann trial itself, I say, was held in 1961 after Eichmann was kidnapped in Argentina. But really, the only reason it was held was because of the lingering scandal and stain of the Kastner trial. Now, I don't know whether you're aware of that in the 1950s.
No, please, feel free to elaborate on that.
Okay, well, I'll try and be as brief as I can. In essence, what happened on April the 10th, 1944, Rudolf Verber and Alfred Wetzler, two Jewish people who were working in Canada, the place in Auschwitz where they sorted the belongings of those who'd been exterminated, they escaped from Auschwitz. It was a perilous escape. They were apart from one other Jew, Lederer, who was taken out of Auschwitz by a friendly SS officer, they were the first real, genuine Jewish escapees. And it was extremely perilous, but thanks to the Auschwitz resistance and Russian prisoners of war who had experience, they got out. And then there was a 2-week trek to Slovakia. And when they were there, they met the Jewish council, the Judenrat, there. And they set down on paper in separate rooms their account of what happened at Auschwitz and what was happening. And the reason they escaped was because they were building a new ramp in Birkenau so that the trains went right up to the gas chambers rather than having to walk 2 or 3 kilometers, which delayed the process. So they were making the gassing of Jews more efficient. And the reason why was Hungary was the last major Jewish community to survive in Europe. And the Nazis had occupied it on March 19th, 1944, because they feared that the Hungarians were going to switch sides in the war, because obviously the war was going badly for Nazi Germany. And what was produced was the Verber-Wetzler report when they sat down, or sometimes it's known as the Auschwitz Protocols when it incorporates other documents as well. For the first time ever, concrete proof existed of the existence of Auschwitz as an extermination camp. prior to that, the belief was that Auschwitz was a major labor camp because it had large numbers of industries, IG Farben, Siemens, and so on. It had about 40 outlets. There were factories in what was called Auschwitz III, where slave labor was used. So it was very, very profitable. That was what Auschwitz was thought to be. I mean, in my book, I go through the fact that Auschwitz was not discovered as an extermination camp because the Allies really did not want to know. But anyway, the fact is that Weber and Wetzler escaped from Auschwitz. They compiled this document, and it was sent abroad to the Vatican and to many other people. It was also given to the personal representative of Hungarian Zionism, Rudolf Kastner, who was the chair or the vice chair of the Zionist Relief and Rescue Committee. And he sat on it. What he did was negotiate an agreement with Eichmann that the Zionist and Jewish elite would leave Hungary on a train, which they did on the 1st of July 1944. So I think it was 1,684 people. Eventually, they went first to Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, and then they went on in 2 stages to Switzerland. So they escaped. But the deal, in essence, was that Eichmann that Kastner would keep quiet about the destination of the deportation trains. Not only that, Kastner was active in misinforming the Jews that where they were going was a fictitious resettlement place called Kenya Maze. And he was instrumental in distributing postcards from another place, Waldsee, from the people who had arrived from the deportation trains in Auschwitz, saying everything was fine, look forward to seeing you, etc. These postcards were, if you like, written or signed by the Jewish deportees when they arrived in Auschwitz. And in fact, when people read them, they managed to see through them because the people who arrived were able to give details of things like your auntie is looking forward to seeing you, even though their auntie had died 10 years ago. So they twigged that something was not right.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, Kastner was instrumental in pacifying the Hungarian Jews who were destined for deportation. And nearly 500,000, 473,000, or no, 437,000 were deported to Auschwitz. And I imagine about 350,000 of them died. I think 80,000 were taken on to labor in Germany itself. But when the Holocaust, those who survived Auschwitz itself came back and came to Israel, they had Kastner in their sights. Why did you misinform us? Why did you lie to us? Why did you tell us that we should get on the trains first to get the best accommodation in a place that didn't exist? And this scandal blew up into the Kastner trial in Israel. It started in 1954. In fact, the allegation had been made that Kastner was a collaborator by this Hungarian Jew called Malchiel Greenwald, and the state had insisted that Kastner bury this by suing him for libel, and that's what happened, except it went wrong, because one of the first questions that was asked was, did you give testimony at Nuremberg to save a Nazi war criminal, Himmler's personal emissary in Hungary, Kurt Becher? And Kastner angrily denied it, and then Shmuel Tamir, who later became a minister under Menachem Begin, produced the affidavit in court, and he was shown to be a liar. And from then it was downhill in the trial. And the judge, 1955, Benjamin Halevi of the Jerusalem District Court, found in his words, the famous words, that he'd sold his soul to Satan. And that was in essence Zionism. And because the government were determined to appeal, the government fell. The second Israeli government under Moshe Sharett fell because of that verdict. So it had huge repercussions in Israel itself. Although Kastner was eventually acquitted by the Supreme Court, it was clearly on political grounds. They found that the facts, as found by the Jerusalem District Court, were true. They also found that in the case of Kurt Becher that he had collaborated. And it was a 4-1, or some people say 3-2 verdict, as one judge, Goyton, was incredibly ambivalent about whether, in fact, he should acquit. So it was a very mixed verdict. But I say the impact of the Kastner trial percolated through. And this is what led, in essence, to the Eichmann trial. And they took extreme precautions at the Eichmann trial to ensure that the Kastner affair was not raised in any sense, shape, or form. So, for instance, the last commander of the Warsaw Ghetto Resistance, Marek Edelman, was not invited. Neither was Rudolf Verba. Apparently, Israel could not afford their airfare from Western Europe or Poland in Marek Edelman's case. So, I mean, this is the reality of the Zionist record during the Holocaust. But I go into it in depth in my book. For most anti-fascists in Europe, certainly in Britain, where I was active in the Anti-Nazi League and so on, the Holocaust is a warning of the dangers of fascism and racism. We draw universal conclusions that it must never happen again, never again. But for the Zionists, never again doesn't mean never again for everyone, but simply never again for Jews. And therefore, anything is justified in order to perpetuate the Israeli state. And so Gideon Levy, for instance, in an article in Haaretz, remarked on how each year thousands of Israeli school children are taken to Auschwitz. And the lesson they draw is not that Gaza must not happen because of Auschwitz, but on the contrary, what happens in Gaza is justified because of Auschwitz. That is the lesson that the Zionists draw. It's the exact opposite of the conclusions that anyone who's anti-racist or anti-fascist would draw. And that is why the Holocaust is never seen as a product of fascism, but simply an irrational, eternal hatred of Jews as Jews, for reasons which are unknown, apart from the fact that Jews happen to live in other people's countries. They were guests whose stay had outwelcomed. I mean, that is the basic Zionist argument, that Jews actually cause anti-Semitism. So Israel has weaponized that, of course, during the latest ongoing genocide in Gaza. They're fighting the new Nazis.
Tony, I'm glad that we could do a part 2 here because we had some tech issues before that we'll try to work around this time. Let's just jump right into it here for part 2. And I wanted to prod you a bit more on a point that you were making. You were talking about how, the anti-fascists in Europe took the lessons of the Holocaust and universalized them, right? Whereas when it comes to the issues around Israel and Zionism, it's quite the opposite. So I wanted to use that as like a segue to ask you about a term that we've been hearing more and more about recently as people kind of get hungrier to understand the situation with Palestine. And that's the idea of the Holocaust industry. So can you explain to our audience, what do we mean when we talk about the so-called Holocaust industry? And what does that have to do with Palestine?
Oh, well, it has everything to do with Palestine. Well, it's quite simple. The Zionist movement, having done absolutely nothing to try and prevent or to try and save or to rescue Jewish refugees from the Holocaust while it was happening. And today you wouldn't believe, everything the Zionists mention has something to do with the Holocaust. During the Holocaust itself, they really didn't want to know about the Holocaust. In fact, I think of Boaz Evron's book, Jewish State or Israeli Nation, and he quotes from the Zionist executive minutes that Ben-Gurion, Tabenkin, Weizmann, and all the others, notables on the Zionist executive, were complaining that people, by focusing on the Jewish refugees, were distracting attention and taking away the fundraising from the need to build the Jewish state, which is the priority, as far as they were concerned. the Holocaust was entirely secondary. Indeed, even after they announced, because they'd been forced to, because the evidence had accumulated such that the Holocaust was happening, that was in November 1942, even though they'd known about it for 4 or 5 months. Even after then, they then issued a statement under the name of Yitzhak Greenbaum, who was the chair of the Zionist or the Jewish Agency Rescue Committee, that the Holocaust had come to an end, that there were 55 Polish ghettos in Poland, and that at least 2 million Jews had survived. Where did they get this from? Ostland, a Nazi paper. So they were quoting evidence from the Nazis to prove that there was no Holocaust, for which even Palkor, the Jewish agency, press agency, protested. So it would seem, I mean, there's a really good book by this right-wing Zionist, Shabtai Bet Tzvi. It's entitled "The Ugandan," on the question of the Ugandan situation. He compared it to Uganda, the project under Herzl. Even he said, I mean, they were amazed that they simply didn't want to recognize what was happening. And the reason was because it was really a distraction. I mean, if you're a Zionist and you're a good Zionist and you're a leader, then you were focused entirely on building a Jewish state. And really everything else was beside the matter. It was just secondary at best, and you really did not want to distract and take away from people's efforts, unless you could tie the refugee question to the Zionist question. That was the only exception, because the refugees, the Jews who wanted to escape from Europe, if you could divert them solely in terms of entering Palestine and use them to break down the barriers to immigration, then that was acceptable. But if it was separated, and Ben-Gurion in a famous letter in, December 1938, and if you want, I can quote to you if you're happy.
Yeah, feel free.
Yeah, because it will illustrate my point. I'm just quoting from my book now. I mean, because I've got all these quotations here. He wrote in a memorandum, in fact, to the Zionist executive of the 17th of December, 1938. Bear in mind, this is just a month after Kristallnacht, the Nazi pogrom against the Jews. And he said, if the Jews are faced with a choice between the refugee problem and rescuing Jews from concentration camps on the one hand, and aid for the National Museum in Palestine on the other, the Jewish sense of pity will prevail, and our people's entire strength will be directed at aid for the refugees in the various countries. Zionism will vanish from the agenda, and indeed not only world public opinion in England and America, but also from Jewish public opinion. We are risking Zionism's very existence if we allow the refugee problem to be separated from the Palestine problem. So that's why when they talk about the refusal of the West to admit refugees, they simply do that in terms of Palestine. They don't complain that Britain wouldn't allow them into Britain or America into America. Their only complaint is they weren't allowed to come as settlers to Palestine. And that was a Zionist theme throughout. And there's a very famous quote. I don't know whether you've heard it, but I'm sure your viewers will be interested, because after 1938, Kristallnacht, the world was inflamed, the opinion, and the British made an exception to what was a strict immigration policy, and they agreed to what was called the Kinder Transport, whereby 10,000 Jewish children would be admitted to England from Nazi Germany. That included the conquest in Czechoslovakia. And Ben-Gurion said this. I mean, Ben-Gurion, if you like, laid down the parameters of the policy, but he wasn't in a minority. There was no dissent from what he said. And he said, because they were campaigning that these children should be admitted to Palestine, not to England. And he said, if I knew that it would be possible to save all the children in Germany by bringing them over to England, and only half of them by transporting them to Eretz Yisrael, that is the land of Israel, then I would opt for the second alternative. For we must weigh not only the life of these children, but also the history of the people of Israel. I mean, and that's in his own official biography. It's in many other documents. No one disputes that quote at all. And indeed, if you really want to know about Ben-Gurion's attitude throughout the Holocaust, you could do worse than read Shabtai Teveth's hagiography, really, of Ben-Gurion. The very final chapter, which is entitled Disaster Means Strength. And what that meant was that the greater the disaster to the Jewish people, the stronger the Zionist movement. Because without the disaster, there would have been maybe no Israel, because they wouldn't have had those refugees. And they were utterly and totally cynical about that. I could give you another quote, and this is from his biographer, who's a good Zionist, Shabtai Teveth. And he said, and this is on page 851 of The Burning Ground, which says the official biography of Ben-Gurion. He said, if there was a line in Ben-Gurion's mind between the beneficial disaster and an all-destroying catastrophe, it must have been a very fine one. The beneficial disaster, of course, was the Holocaust.
Wow. So it's such an interesting way to look at it in the sense of, okay, on the one hand, Israel's like, oh yeah, we suffer from Holocaust trauma. That's what drives everything we do. But in reality, it's like they need the Holocaust trauma to exist. But there's another part of this I'm curious if you could talk about. And that is the way that this Holocaust industry is then used to transfer guilt and responsibility for the Holocaust onto Palestinians to make it okay to essentially steal from them and destroy them. And you even mention in the piece you wrote for the Electronic Intifada, you mentioned how at Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum in Israel, how it's devoted an entire wall to the Grand Mufti, who, by the way, let me remind people, at one point Netanyahu a few years ago even tried to accuse the Grand Mufti of actually giving Hitler the idea for the Holocaust. Like the guy literally tried to blame Palestinians for the Holocaust. But I guess, can you talk about that element of this Holocaust industry, the way it's used on the one hand to basically absolve Europeans, absolve Germans of the responsibility for their actual committal of this heinous act, and then transfer it onto the victims of colonialism in Palestine?
Well, yes. I mean, that's one of the reasons why Germany is so keen on supporting Israel, because it does shift the blame to, if you like, the victims of the victims, except, of course, most Israelis weren't victims in the first place. But the Holocaust industry is, if you like, the whole propaganda industry and everything that's built around it, the Holocaust memorials, the museums, the educational trusts, and so on. You see that in this country, in the United States, all of it geared to one message, which is Israel is the answer to the Holocaust. And of course, it isn't any answer at all. And what they do, of course, is they completely decontextualize the Holocaust itself and what caused it, and the anti-Semitism. Because anti-Semitism for Zionists is not society. It's not where you live. It's not the scapegoating. It's not the racism against Jews and so on. It was simply the fact that, people like you are inherently anti-Semitic because you're not Jewish. You can't help it. It's in your DNA. And having inherited it, as Pinsker said, for 2,000 years, it's an incurable disease. So they call it a virus, because it's a virus is something you can't, or generally can't combat, certainly not at that time. But B, that the other cause of it is that Jews are living outside their national home. I mean, it's a kind of blood and soil thing, the belief that every people has an attachment to the land through their own blood and soil and so on. And that Jews had lost that. They were, in the words of A.B. Yehoshua, a famous Zionist novelist who's just died, they were guests in other people's countries. They used those countries like people use hotels, and they outstayed their welcome. And so Jacob Klatskin, who was a Zionist theoretician, he developed the Zionist magazine. He said, instead of defending our rights against the anti-Semites who want to take away our rights, we should defend ourselves against those who oppose anti-Semitism, because they are denying us, if you like, our right to live in Palestine. Yeah, so they were opposed to the anti-fascists, and that's why, I mean, in the period before Hitler came to power, the Zionists took no part at all in any anti-fascist activity. And they didn't in Britain. Zionism has never fought anti-Semitism because how can you? It's futile, as Herzl said. You can't eradicate it if it's in your blood. What can we do? I mean, that was a Zionist message. And that's why Zionism was considered by Jewish socialists and revolutionaries as a totally reactionary ideology. And in Poland, I mean, I don't know whether you know, but in the last 3 elections in 1938, I think it was May 1938, in Warsaw, for example, there were Jews elected separate members to the councils because they were a national minority. Out of the 20 council seats up for election, the Bund, which was an anti-Zionist Jewish social democratic party, won 17. The Zionists won 1. And that was repeated throughout Poland. In other words, Polish Jews, amongst whom Zionism had a base in the 20s, had simply abandoned Zionism because it was seen as legitimizing everything the anti-Semites said. The anti-Semites said you don't belong, and the Zionists said, yes, we agree. So, but the Holocaust industry, of course, doesn't mention that. It's there to guilt trip people, to weaponize it, not to draw universal lessons, but to draw one particular lesson, which is that the only answer to anti-Semitism, to the Holocaust and so on, is Jews leaving the countries they live in and settling in Palestine, which is why, say, after Pittsburgh, or after, say, the Charlie Hebdo killings, and there was 4 Jews were murdered in the Hypercacher supermarket in France. Netanyahu came to Paris and told the French Jews in a speech in a synagogue, your real home is not in France, it's in Israel. And they immediately burst out singing the Marseillaise.
Right. I remember that. And it's so, I mean, the irony, of course, is it's like taking essentially the Nazi view of what makes a Jew, which is this idea of this racial, I mean, it is, Jews have been obviously racialized across Europe, especially. But it's taking that idea and going with it. It's going with it. And it's also like erasing an entire diverse cultural history, because obviously, like, Jewish culture in Germany is not the same as Jewish culture in Morocco or in Iraq or in Latin America. But it's taking all this entirely like racially diverse religious group and essentially projecting European Jewish history onto everyone in a way that, you know, just not only erases history, but changes the entire dynamics of entire regions in the global South. But that's, of course, a different story here that I hope to cover on a different episode. But, you know, I want to actually ask you a personal question.
Sure.
I thought it was quite interesting when I was reading some of your bio that you, in fact, are the son of an Orthodox Jewish rabbi.
Yeah.
And when you were young, you were a member of a religious Zionist group that you describe as now an integral part of the Messianic settler movement. So I'm curious, like, you know, how did you end up shifting from growing up in that environment to having the views that you do now, which are like diametrically opposed to all of that?
I suppose that my father was a traveling rabbi, so he ministered to different congregations in Stoke-on-Trent in the Midlands, in Coventry in the Midlands, in Southport, which is in the Wirral, and then in Merthyr in Wales. And Merthyr was certainly formative because it was a heavily mining area. Literally, you weighed the Labour vote, you didn't count it. You know, and if you were a Tory, a Conservative, you could get beaten up at school for that. You know, miners hated the Conservatives. They hated Churchill, incidentally, because you sent the police in to shoot the strikers. And that rubbed off on me. And there was a kind of radicalism. And I suppose I became a Marxist from a very early age because I saw the irrationality of capitalism, the dog-eat-dog mentality, that you don't produce for what people need, you don't plan production, you don't arrange society so that everybody has a stake in it and the control, that there is vast wealth, etc. All of that impinged upon me. And Zionism, you see, I mean, Marxism and socialism say that workers of the world have everything in common and that you unite, whereas Zionism says Jews unite, that our enemy is the non-Jew, in a sense. We have more in common. Blood is thicker than water was a common phrase that was used. And so it was a kith and kin movement, and I felt it myself. I wouldn't say I was able to articulate it necessarily, but I felt it was an exclusivist ideology and movement. And people would urge me. I mean, at that time, I remember people in Mapam, supporters of Mapam, the old left Zionist party, go to Israel, settle on the kibbutz. That's socialism. But of course, it wasn't. And when I went to Israel, it was my only visit on a Zionist Federation tour, the kind of early type of birthright. I mean, I just saw all the racism, even amongst the kibbutzniks, you know, the Arabs, as they called them. And it didn't seem very socialist to me. So I guess that, but also I didn't like the message that was coming from the Holocaust. I mean, at the age of 8, I suppose I was quite a prodigious child in a way. I read Lord Russell of Liverpool's Scourge of the Swastika. He was the chief legal counsel at the Nuremberg trial for the British prosecution of the Nazi war criminals. And he wrote this book about the horrors of Auschwitz. And I thought, how can people do this to other people? And the lessons I drew were that racism was wrong, whoever it applied to. But for Zionism, racism is only wrong if it's against Jews. And so the messages I had were starting to differ from those which were mainstream in the Jewish community. And I think at that time it was a very solitary experience being a Jewish anti-Zionist. I had maybe one friend who was non-Zionist, but I knew no one else who was. So, I mean, you got vilified and pilloried and so on and so forth. Whereas today, of course, it's rapidly becoming a movement of its own. It's no longer a mark of disgrace or shame to be opposed to Israel, because Israel has now come out. The Labour Zionists were very good at the propaganda, you see. They won over the Social Democrats, etc. I mean, supporters of the Arabs were often on the Labour right, people like Christopher Mackey. But today, almost without exception, there is a solid block of the right in support of Zionism. And that extends to the neo-Nazi right. It's not just the conservative right. You know, Richard Spencer will proudly declare, I'm a white Zionist. Because they actually don't see Israelis as Jews. They see them as themselves. Yeah.
Right. They're the spearhead of the West, of the Judeo-Christian white culture that they're trying to preserve
I mean,
across the world or whatnot. Yeah.
this myth of
Uh,
the Judeo-Christian heritage. I mean,
right.
what was it? A history of pogroms. It's absurd.
Let's just forget about all that. I also wanted to ask you, you note that you were a co-founder in 1982 of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign
Yeah.
in the UK, which you resigned from in 2021.
Yeah.
You say they abandoned Zionism. Can you elaborate a bit on what happened there?
Yeah, I mean, I actually resigned. It was the second time I resigned from it. I resigned from it in 1993 when they voted to support the Oslo Accords. I wrote, in fact, an article. It was a debate with the Jewish Socialist Group when I basically said, "This is the biggest disaster that's happened to the Palestinians since the Nakba. You will live to regret it." And unfortunately, every prediction I made has come true. I said, you're just replacing the faces of Israeli police and soldiers with Palestinians. Nothing else will change. But unfortunately, again, I was in the minority. It's been an occupation in my life, always being in the minority or often being in the minority. But minorities are usually right. So I take solace from that. But in 2021, or no, that's 2022, PSC adopted a new constitution and it abandoned any explicit anti-Zionism because the logic, they never articulated it, of course, because they never do, but it puts off the mainstream, and their whole slogan is mainstreaming, getting Palestine into the mainstream, without realizing that the establishment is never going to adopt support for the Palestinians because there are reasons why it supports Israel, and they have nothing to do with human rights as we see today. So I felt there was no point in remaining in an organization which I didn't agree with. And that's why I resigned. And it attacked Palestine Action repeatedly. It refused to support direct action. It had no strategy at all in terms of, it would never say, for instance, that we support a democratic state, not a Jewish state, which I think should be one of the main slogans now, the Palestine Solidarity Movement. We have to bring that, not only one state to the fore, but actually put it in terms that people understand. And that is, I think, that slogan. PSC would have none of it. It wanted to, it put Starmer, it put Lisa Nandy, it put Emily Thornycroft, all the people who are now part of Keir Starmer's shadow cabinet and who are absolute Israel supporters and Zionists and proud Zionists, Yet PSC was putting them on its platform. And what did it gain? Absolutely nothing. So I'm afraid we had to part company. I took part with Palestine Action. So I did now, along with others, for supporting Hamas. I haven't. I've always said politically I don't agree with an Islamist movement, but there are also a resistance movement. And in that sense, yes, of course, I support the resistance. So but PSC believe that if you water down your politics enough, then people will come to accept it. I don't think so. I think if you put your principles to the fore and say why it is you support a single state, people are much more likely to be attracted to that. Because Palestine is not just a human rights question, although obviously it is, but it's a political question. And basically, Israel is an illegitimate state. It's based on ethno-nationalism. And you look at Europe under Nazi occupation, the 30s and the 40s, all the most anti-Semitic countries were the ethno-Christian countries, Romania, Hungary, Croatia, which had its own extermination camp, the only one outside Nazi-occupied, outside Nazi control, or Slovakia, which was the first to deport Jews to Auschwitz. All of these based their ethnicity, their nationality, on a religion. And so, which is what Israel does. Of course, it's inherently to be anything else.
Yeah, exactly. And I want to ask you, I want to kind of go back to where we started and what your article is about. And so you've explained, You've explained the fact that Israel's not, in fact, driven by Holocaust trauma. And in the sort of part one of this, you went into the fact, you made some parallels about other parts of the world where, in fact, you know, these colonial movements, in many cases, their barbarity, their brutality is driven by, obviously, you know, they have to get something done. They have to get the indigenous population to submit. They have to make sure that they're too scared to rise up and to resist. But also there's a fear, there's an element of fear there that the victims of their barbarity are going to turn around and do the same thing to them. So can you explain what drives, if it's not Holocaust drama, what drives Israeli behavior?
Well, I mean, what drives it, in essence, being an ethno-nationalist state, an ethno-religious state, is the desire to have, I mean, in the words of Yair Lapid, as few Palestinians, as he says, as possible, maximum land, fewest Arabs. I mean, that's what he said. And he is of the centre-left in Israel. He's not the Ben Gavirs or the Smotrics. So that's a dynamic. You have to, if you want a Jewish state, you need as many Jews as possible and as few non-Jews. And that's the heart of it. That's what keeps it together. And the reality is, if there were no Palestinians, then Israeli Jews would fall amongst themselves. There would be a civil war, which we started to see before October the 7th, because there is a fundamental contradiction. Half of Israel sees itself as Jewish first, and the other half sees itself as Israeli first. They're united in hatred of the Palestinians. That is what binds them. That is the irony. It is the Palestinians which keeps Israel together. But of course, they don't realise that kind of dialectical contradiction.
Yeah.
So that, in essence, is what drives them. And of course, settler colonialism is inherently expansionist as well. So Israel really knows no borders. And if, for example, they manage to expel all the Palestinians or most of them from the West Bank, then sooner or later there would be another casus belli on the border with Jordan. And soon enough, you would have Israeli raids into Jordan, and the Jordanian regime would be accused of fostering terrorism, and so on. And so it just goes on, really, because after all, the land of Israel, so there's plenty of room for expansion.
Well, Tony, I want to ask you one more question, and that's another personal question. You are involved with Palestine Action, and you're facing prosecution and potential prison time for your involvement in that activism. And then you also mentioned to me when we were getting started that you have had your devices confiscated by the authorities in the UK for supposedly support for Hamas. So why don't you tell me about the political persecution you faced in the so-called civilized Western country of the United Kingdom?
Terrorism is being weaponized, if you like, in order to suppress free speech. Although the accusation is not that I've been secretly planting to bomb somewhere, but that I've said the wrong things at the wrong time. And that applies it applies to many other people who've also been arrested, because you see the weaponization of anti-Semitism. I mean, it's quite amazing. The demonstration in London last Saturday, who did they arrest? 2 Orthodox rabbis who were anti-Zionists because they burnt an Israeli flag. And what were they arrested for? Incitement to anti-Semitism. You know, I mean, this is amazing. You know, the police who kill black people in custody, who shoot them. I mean, there are so many examples who are proven to be racist, institutionally racist. And that's not me. That was the Baroness Casey review of a couple of years ago. She went through all the WhatsApp messages and so on of these police groups and said, yeah, they're institutionally racist, sexist, homophobic. But when it comes to anti-Semitism, suddenly they're really concerned about Jews, who are the least persecuted minority in Britain. I mean, the anti-Semitism is a kind of vestigial prejudice at best, or worst. I mean, it's not any form of state racism today. I mean, racism changes; it doesn't remain the same. But same with, I mean, I don't know whether you're aware of the internal politics of Britain, but Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary, who resigned, she'd accused the police of being pro-Palestinian, which was a step too far. She was absolutely horrified by these hate marches, these mobs, these anti-Semites, and so on. She was the person who was trying to deport refugees to Rwanda in order to stop the boat people. So when it came to any other form of racism, she was in the vanguard of it. But when it comes to anti-Semitism, she's horrified by it. I mean, what do you make of this? And the reason is because it's weaponized. And that is the political atmosphere in this country, that the right wing, all of those who were 60, 70 years ago or more were anti-Semites, and who didn't like Jews, and who did think they were cosmopolitans who were plotting to undermine national unity and so on. Today, the right wing is really opposed to anti-Semitism, or what they define as anti-Semitism, which of course is support for Israel. So anti-Semitism and support for Zionism is absolutely bound up. If you don't like Israel, you don't like Jews in their view. What that means, of course, is anti-Zionist Jews are made invisible. We don't exist. And the same in Germany. I mean, Germany, which has just bust up a Palestine Congress and arrested and beaten up people there and so on, including Jewish anti-Zionists, I mean, if they're opposed to Israel, they're the wrong sort of Jew, as we said. Well, yeah, I mean, there is an irony in all of this, that in 1933, and on the 28th of January 1935, Reinhard Heydrich, who was described by who was it? He was described as the real engineer of the final solution by Gerald Rettlinger. He issued a directive. I mean, he was in charge of the Gestapo, and he was second to Himmler in the SS. And he said the activity of the Zionist-oriented youth organizations that are engaged in the occupational restructuring of the Jews lies in the interest of the National Socialist state leadership. These organizations are not to be treated with that strictness that it is necessary to apply to the members of the so-called German Jewish assimilationists. Assimilationists meant, in essence, none or anti-Zionists. And in May 1935, the paper of the SS, Schwarzkopf, wrote that the Zionists adhere to a strict racial position. By emigrating to Palestine, they are helping to build their own Jewish state, whereas the assimilation-minded Jews deny their race and insist on their loyalty to Germany, or claim to be Christians because they've been baptized in order to subvert National Socialist principles. And this was the position of the Gestapo, in essence.
Wow.
That you had to make a distinction between the Zionists and the rest of the Jews, bearing in mind that in 1933, just 2% of the German Jews were Zionists. It was a minority. It was a kind of free counterculture. But of course, people forget this now. Until the Holocaust, Zionism was a distinct minority amongst the Jews. And that's why when people occasionally, and it is occasionally, come out with anti-Semitic stuff about Hitler was right or so on the Palestine side, they need to be squashed, because the most beneficial supporter, really, of the proto-Israeli state and the Zionist movement was Hitler. Without the Nazis, they probably wouldn't have got the critical mass of settlers necessary to establish their state. So the Zionists, I mean, and they realized that as well, that the advent of Hitler would do for them what they couldn't do by themselves, which was win over the Jewish people.
Well, on that note, Tony, I want to thank you for coming on and breaking all this down. It's all so important. Can you please remind people about your book and where they can get it? Because I think it's very important subject matter for everyone interested in this topic right now.
Yes, sure. If you simply send me an email to Tony Greenstein 104@gmail.com. I don't have any at the moment, but I'm getting some more in because there's actually been a rush on them, because I think with what's happening in Gaza, people really do want to know how it is that Israel behaves in the way it does. As I say, I mean, I had to in the end self-publish because it was too hot a topic even for left-wing publishers. But it's gone down very well, and this is the kind of hidden history of Zionism that the Zionists would rather gloss over. So you're welcome. It's £12 for a paperback. In fact, I'll only have paperbacks, so you're welcome. Anyone who wants to buy one to do so. Okay, well, thank you very much, Rania. It's been
Thank you.
really enjoyable.